Hello and welcome back to this series. I'm Miss Kane and today's video is going to be focusing on the characterization within a hanging. Today we're going to be looking specifically at the prisoner, Francis and the superintendent. Firstly, we're going to look at the prisoner, as obviously he is one of the central pillars of this text. On the right hand side on your screen we have a quote which is the first description that we get of him in the text. One prisoner had been brought out of his cell. He was a Hindu, a puny wisp of a man with a shaven head and vague liquid eyes. He had a thick sprouting moustache, absurdly too big for his body, rather like the moustache of a comic man on the films. 6 tall Indian warders were guarding him and getting him ready for the gallows. 2 of them stood by with rifles and fixed bayonets, while the others handcuffed him, passed a chain through his handcuffs and fixed it to their belts, and lashing his arms tight to his sides. They crowded very close about him, with their hands always on him in a careful caressing grip, as though all the while feeling him to make sure he was there. It was like men handling a fish, which is still alive, may jump back into the water, but he stood quite unresisting, yielding his arms limply to the ropes, as though he hardly noticed what was happening. Now, obviously, that's quite a detailed description for the first time that we see him. So on the left-hand side of your screen, as you can see at the minute, there is 5 questions asking you to tackle that quotation. So what I would like you to do just now is to pause the video, have an attempt at those questions, and when you're ready, press play again and we will go over the answers. So let's go over those answers now. Question 1 asked you to think about how does Orwell immediately create sympathy for the prisoner through word choice. So the one example that we've pulled out is the word choice of puny, which suggests he is small, weak and vulnerable. Obviously there are other examples, but that's just the one that we're going to look at just now. For question number 2, it asked you to think about how this impression of the prisoner is reinforced by how he is guarded. So despite the fact that he's obviously very small, he is guarded by 6 men who are tall and therefore much bigger than him and are very heavily armed. For question number 3, you had to think about, do you think the guards are being excessive in their treatment of him? So despite seeming small and weak, the prisoner is handcuffed and had his arms tied tightly into his body. On top of this, they hold him as they move him towards the gallows. All of this suggests an excessive approach to escorting him to the gallows. Question number 4 asks you to think about which sentence structure technique is used to emphasise the precautions they take to stopping him escaping. So a list is used to emphasise the number of ways they are attempting to stop any potential escape. And last but not least, question number 5 asks you to explain the word choice used to show that the prisoner has no intention of escaping. So the word that we've picked out is unresisting, and that's obviously the main word, which shows these precautions are unnecessary as he has no intention of escaping. Now, as I've mentioned in the previous videos, this series is obviously intended to help you write a critical essay at National 5. So whilst it's fantastic that we're able to answer these questions, that's not enough to obviously get us marks in our critical essay. So we need to start thinking about how we can take all of this information and put it together into a continuous paragraph. So on the screen in front of you is a fully fleshed out paragraph about the characterization of the prisoner. So we're going to read it through before we break it down into its various components, and then ultimately you have a chance to try and write your own. Orwell's characterization of the prisoner immediately allows the reader to feel sympathetic towards him. The physical description of the man shows that he is in no position to rebel against the prison guards. One prisoner had been brought out of his cell. He was a Hindu, a puny wisp of a man with a shaven head and vague liquid eyes. Through the word choice of puny, the reader is able to understand that this man is small, weak and vulnerable. He has clearly had a difficult life in this prison, and although this life has been terrible, being alive is the one thing he has left, and even that is about to be taken from him. As Burma was colonised by the British, there was a clear separation of ethnic groups, which was part of their ruling strategy. It could be argued that Orwell pays distinct attention to the fact that this man is a Hindu in order to alert the reader to this and to highlight that this man is othered compared to the men who run the prison. It is also immediately clear to the reader that this man is resigned to his fate. But he stood quite unresisting, yielding his arms limply to the ropes as though he hardly noticed what was happening. The word choice of unresisting and yielding shows that the many precautions taken by the guards to ensure that he does not escape are unnecessary, as he has no intention of escaping. The prisoner seems to have completely given up and is trying to detach from the situation as much as he can. This illustrates that it is not only the prison officials who try to detach from the prospect of the hanging, but even the condemned men as well. So now that we have read through that paragraph in its entirety, let's start to break it down into the various components and figure out how we're going to get marks for each part of this. So straight away, we want to make sure that we are alerting our marker to what exactly our paragraph is going to be about. By the end of this series, you are going to be sick of hearing me say this. However, I cannot stress how important it is. So straight away, we are alerting our marker to the fact that we are talking about characterization in this paragraph. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the prisoner, how we feel sympathy towards him, and we're going to start off by focusing on the physical description of the man. Next up, we're going to include our quotation. That way, we know exactly what part of the text we are referencing, and it is not too long, but yet not too short. We're then going to start breaking it down into the different, very specific aspects of that quotation that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at word choice and puny, and how this emphasises the fact that the man is small, weak, and vulnerable. And it shows that you are alerting your marker that you know that those words emphasise the fact that he's had a difficult life in the prison, and although that his life is terrible, being alive is the one thing that he has left, and even that's about to be taken from him. It can also be a good idea at this point to introduce some historical context to your paragraph. That way you're alerting your marker to the fact that you've studied out with just the basic text and are aware of the political context in which the story was written. So that's where we've introduced the fact that Burma was colonised by the British and the clear separation of the ethnic groups that was part of their ruling strategy. And then you've highlighted how that impacts the text, because it could be argued that the only reason Orwell points out that the man was a Hindu was to highlight his otherness compared to the people who run the prison. We're then going to move on to talk about how we know that the man is resigned to his fate by including this quotation, but he stood quite unresisting, yielding his arms limply to the ropes as though he hardly noticed what was happening. We're then going to break it down into the fact that we're still looking at the word choice and that we're looking at unresisting and yielding this time. And that shows that the many precautions that have been taken by the guards to ensure that he doesn't escape are completely unnecessary, as he has no intention of escaping. And once again, you are alerting your marker to the fact that you know these specific words have this impact on the reader's understanding of the text. You then further explore your analysis by pointing out that this indicates to the reader that the prisoner has no intention of escaping and has completely given up and is trying to detach himself from the situation as much as he can. This contributes to the overall analysis of the story because it highlights that it's not only the prison officials who are trying to detach from the prospect of the hanging, but even the condemned men themselves, which, kind of adds a more roundness to your overall analysis. So we're now going to move on to looking at the character of the superintendent. We're going to look specifically at the quote that's on your screen right now. The superintendent of the jail, who was standing apart from the rest of us, moodily prodding the gravel with his stick, raised his head at the sound. He was an army doctor with a grey toothbrush moustache and a gruff voice. "For God's sake, hurry up, Francis," he said irritably. "The man ought to have been dead by this time. Aren't you ready yet?" So below are two questions, although question one does have 5 parts, that ask you to analyse this quotation in detail. So like I said previously, I suggest you pause the video just now, answer those questions, and then press play again when you are ready to go over the answers. So let's go over those answers now. Question 1 for all 5 parts is basically asking you to analyse the effective examples of word choice. So we have moodily prodding for the first one, suggests that he is bad-tempered and impatient to get started so that it can be over. We then have his stick, suggests that he is armed with a weapon of some sorts. For grey toothbrush moustache, it obviously suggests that he is a military man who is precise, careful, methodical and older. We then have gruff, which means he speaks in a rough and abrupt way. And then lastly, we have irritably, which shows that he is in a bad mood and annoyed. Question number 2 asks you to look at his dialogue. What do you think of this and what does it show about the superintendent? So the superintendent's dialogue suggests that he is clearly in a hurry, he doesn't like being late, or wants things to run on time. It also shows he's deeply insensitive and indifferent to the prisoner who is walking to the gallows to be executed. We're now going to look at a slightly bigger quotation that still focuses in on the superintendent. So below we have, suddenly the superintendent made up his mind. Throwing up his head, he made a swift motion with his stick. Challo, he shouted almost fiercely. The superintendent reached out with his stick and poked the bare body. It oscillated slightly. He's all right, said the superintendent. He backed out from under the gallows and blew out a deep breath. The moody look had gone out of his face quite suddenly. He glanced at his wristwatch. 8 minutes past 8. Well, that's all for this morning, thank God. I found that I was laughing quite loudly. Everyone was laughing. Even the superintendent grinned in a tolerant way. You'd better all come out and have a drink, he said quite genially. I've got a bottle of whiskey in the car. We could do with it. So obviously these quotations cover the actual execution of the man all the way to the aftermath of the execution. So we have again some questions on the right hand side, and as pointed out, these are sections from the end of the story. So you're looking for evidence this time that indicates he is officious, he is keen to get it over with, he is relieved that it has gone without any trouble, and that he is unaffected by it, but he doesn't enjoy it either. So what I recommend you do is you pause the video, you answer these questions, and then you come back when you are ready to go over the answers. So let's go over those answers now. So the pieces of evidence that suggest he is officious are swift motion with his stick and reached out with his stick and poked the bare body. We then have keen to get it over with. We have the word choice of fiercely, and also he glanced at his wristwatch. 8 minutes past 8. Well, that's all for this morning, thank God. Relieved it has gone off without any trouble comes from the moody look had gone out of his face quite suddenly, and grinned in a tolerant way. You'd better all come out and have a drink, he said quite genially. And last but not least, any of the words that indicate that he is unaffected by it but doesn't enjoy it either comes from, he's all right, said the superintendent. He backed out from under the gallows and blew out a deep breath. And I've got a bottle of whiskey in the car. We could do with it. So once again, we now need to take this information and we need to put it together into a final paragraph. So let's read the paragraph once more before we break it down into its components. Orwell's characterisation of the superintendent depicts a man who clearly does not want to spend any longer in this prison than he has to. When the reader is first introduced to his character, we see that he is in a hurry for the execution to be over. For God's sake, hurry up, Francis, he said irritably. The man ought to have been dead by this time. Aren't you ready yet? The superintendent's dialogue suggests he is in a hurry, doesn't like to be late, or wants things to run on time. He clearly has little sympathy for the prisoner who is walking to the gallows to be executed. The word irritably suggests not only is the superintendent impatient for this execution to be over, but also that he feels annoyed at being forced to handle the situation in the first place. Orwell's exploration of the immorality of capital punishment is further explored when the superintendent goes to inspect the body. "He's all right," said the superintendent. He backed out from under the gallows and blew out a deep breath. Orwell attempts here to show the dehumanising which occurs when one takes part in the killing of another person. The superintendent has detached himself from the action of killing another human being and is able to look at the action from a purely objective standpoint. So if we start to break it down into the various components that have gone together to making this little paragraph. So once again, we have indicated to our marker that we are talking about characterization, and that this time we are focusing on the superintendent and how his depiction is put together. We've then included our quotation that is neither too short nor too long and yet has enough that we can discuss to make sure that we have a decent amount of analysis in our paragraph. We then have broken it down into focusing specifically on his dialogue and kind of emphasising what that reveals about his character. And it's really clear to the marker that we know that this is a connection between what he is saying and how it develops his overall characterisation, which is obviously going to gain us some marks. We've then gone on to talk about a specific word choice example, and this time we've looked at irritably and how that very specific word choice contributes once again to his overall characterization. Again, this is really important because it highlights to your marker that you understand what characterization is as a technique and how writers are able to deploy it within their work. We've also highlighted one of the main themes of the text, which is the immorality of capital punishment, and made that super clear to the marker that this is what we're now going to be talking about. We've then included another quotation that further illustrates that point and makes clear to the marker that you know you need an extra piece of information if you're going to be talking about something different. We've then once again discussed how that quotation and that theme highlights the characterization of the superintendent and what that reveals about his character to the reader, and emphasised how important that is. Obviously, all of this put together makes our paragraph on the characterization of the superintendent. So, what I suggest you do now is once again pause this video, have an attempt at writing your own paragraph on the superintendent, making sure that you cover the various aspects of his personality. Alright, so pause the video and press play again when you're ready to move on to our final character that we're going to be looking at, which is Francis. So the last character that we're going to be looking at in this video is Francis. So on your screen right now we have a quotation that we're going to be using for the predominant analysis of Francis. So we have Francis, the head jailer, a fat Dravidian in a white drill suit and gold spectacles, waved his black hand. Yes, sir, he bubbled. All is satisfactorily prepared. The hangman is waiting. We shall proceed. So on your screen right now are 3 questions that ask you to analyse this quotation. So again, pause the video, answer the questions, and come back when you're ready to go over the answers. So let's go over those answers. We have question number 1 was asking you to think about what does bubbled suggest about Francis. So bubbled suggests that Francis is excited or feeling positive about the situation. It could also suggest he is behaving obsequiously to the superintendent. For question 2, it asks you to think about why is it an odd word to use in this context. So obviously they're preparing for an execution. It's not a positive or exciting situation, which makes it weird at the fact that he is bubbling over with enthusiasm. For question 3, it asks you to think about Orwell opts to mock Francis's speech. Which technique does he use to do this? So Orwell uses alliteration of the S sound, which can also be called sibilance, to mock Francis's speech. So once again, we now need to take all of this information and put it together into a final paragraph. So again, we'll read through this example answer before we break it down into the various components. Orwell's characterisation of Francis depicts a man who has benefited from Britain's colonialisation of Burma. Once again, Orwell focuses on a physical description of the character when we are first introduced to him. Francis, the head jailer, a fat Dravidian in a white drill suit and gold spectacles, waved his black hand. Yes, sir, he bubbled. All is satisfactorily prepared. The hangman is waiting. We shall proceed. The specific word choice of bubbled suggests that Francis is excited or feeling positive about the upcoming hanging. Whilst he could be behaving obsequiously to the superintendent, they are ultimately preparing for an execution, and his behaviour is entirely out of place. This is not a positive or exciting situation, despite his attitude. He is also characterised as being fat and also having a white drill suit and gold spectacles. This seems to represent the fact that he sees the world through the eyes of an affluent person who has no worries of personal security, which is in direct contrast with the prisoners. The fact he is described as fat suggests that he is well treated and looked after by the state. Orwell also uses alliteration of the S sound to mock Francis's speech. It could be argued that this represents his evil based on the fact his speech is described as a series of hissing noises and could be symbolic of the biblical snake that brings woe to all mankind. So now let's pull this apart and look at the various components that make up this paragraph. So once again, at the beginning of our paragraph, we are including our point and making it exceedingly clear to our marker what exactly we're going to be talking about in that paragraph. So we've highlighted that we're going to be talking about the characterisation of Francis, how he has benefited from Britain's colonisation of Burma, and that we're going to be looking at his physical description when we're first introduced to him. This is a great way to highlight to your marker what they should be expecting in your paragraph. However, if you include all of this in your point, please make sure that you talk about all of this in your analysis. Do not put things in your point that are then not in your analysis. We then have our quotation. Again, it's not too long, it's not too short, it's something that could easily be remembered for a prelim or an exam, and yet it's still got enough meat to it that we have enough to talk about for our analysis. We've then chosen to start off once again with a very specific example of word choice and how that contributes to his characterisation, and how we know that because this word choice is out of place in this situation, it shows to us that Francis is a bit of an odd character and that we're not entirely sure what to make of him as the reader. We then go on to further explore his physical description and the implications this has for his characterisation and the world in which this character lives. And all of this kind of contributes to emphasising to the reader how this character is viewed by their world, which obviously contributes to a rounder characterisation. We then look at our last technique for this paragraph, which is the alliteration sound, and this could be something that you could include in your paragraph if you were really wanting to push your analysis of this character, if it was relevant to your essay question, and the fact that you're pulling in external information about references to, the Bible and things like that could boost your overall grade and further your analysis. So this brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for sticking with me, guys. Again, I know that these videos are getting longer and longer. It's just we've got more ground to cover. So all of these would be incredibly useful if you were focusing in on how the hanging affects different people within the story, or if you were focusing in on the characterization of specific characters, as obviously that's what this video is entirely about. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the structure of the text, focusing in on the time and distance of the text. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic week.